When Daniel Holt emerged from the Amazon, barefoot, sunburnt, and whispering in a language no one had spoken for centuries, the villagers didn't cheer, they screamed. A week earlier, he was just another grieving foreigner with a backpack and a satellite phone. Now, he couldn't look at his reflection, wouldn't speak to his own name, and traced cryptic symbols into the soil at dawn. The question is no longer what happened to Daniel. It's whether Daniel ever came back at all. The jungle didn't hum that morning. It held its breath. A dense, unnatural silence wrapped around the trees like a warning. When the rescue team finally spotted Daniel Holt, he was sitting motionless in the middle of a clearing that no one remembered being on the map, even though this area had been trekked and charted for decades. His eyes were bloodshot, his lips cracked, his skin mottled with insect bites and smears of ash. What was more disturbing, however, was the way he rocked slowly back and forth, barefoot in the mud, mumbling to the sky in a language none of the rescuers recognized. One of the older trackers, Tiago, immediately froze and whispered something under his breath before slowly backing away. When asked what Daniel was saying, Tiago only muttered, "That's Karu," then made a cross over his chest. Karu was a language of an extinct tribe believed to have vanished 100 years ago, its last speakers supposedly swallowed by the forest itself. The medic attempted to approach Daniel with a hydration pack, but Daniel hissed like a cornered animal and flinched as if the sight of clean water burned him. What unnerved the team most wasn't his reaction. It was the fact that, for a moment, the surrounding trees rustled in perfect sync with his voice, even though there was no wind. The canopy trembled, not randomly, but rhythmically, as if responding to his chant. It wasn't weather. It was mimicry. When they finally got Daniel into the boat that would take them back to the edge of Alto Rio, he clutched a bundle of dirt in his hand and stared at it the entire ride without blinking. Every time the boat motor stalled or the water rippled too suddenly, Daniel would mutter a single word and the water would still. The ranger steering the boat said it felt like they weren't being followed but watched, an intense, omnipresent gaze pressing against their backs. When they reached the village, the reaction was instant. Doors slammed. Children were pulled inside. One elderly woman dropped her food basket when she saw Daniel and sprinted to the church, whispering a prayer through sobs. That night, Daniel was placed in the local clinic, though he wouldn't sleep. Instead, he carved strange symbols into the wall with his fingernails, dozens of them, spirals, arrows, shapes that looked like eyes and vines coiled around each other. A visiting nurse from Manaus noted that many of the symbols resembled patterns found at abandoned tribal ceremonial sites far upriver. But Daniel hadn't been upriver. He'd gone west, into a restricted zone marked by red tape and ignored by maps. Terra do Cicero, the Whispering Land. Word spread quickly. The villagers didn't want him there. They said no one who entered that part of the forest ever returned the same, and that the spirits living there weren't dead, they were dormant. Daniel, they insisted, had brought something back with him. The local priest sprinkled holy water around the clinic. Dogs barked constantly at night. The birds that normally sang at sunrise were silent. Then, on the third night, 2 children went missing. They were found 12 hours later, not far from the clinic, standing silently in a clearing, their hands caked in charcoal, their mouths sewn shut, not with thread, but with sticky jungle sap. They were alive, but eerily calm. One of them had a spiral symbol drawn on her forehead, identical to the ones Daniel had etched. That was when the mayor of the village requested assistance from the government. When the first federal agents arrived, Daniel sat still in his cot, eyes wide open, lips moving without sound. A recorder picked up his whispering and when slowed down, the audio revealed multiple layers. Not just one voice, but several, all speaking in different dialects and ancient languages, some identified, others completely unknown. That night, the wind in the trees didn't howl, it whispered. People began to believe it wasn't just Daniel who had changed. The forest itself was reacting. And it was speaking through him. Before Daniel Holt ever stepped into the depths of the Amazon, he was known as the man who broke science for profit. He wasn't always that man. Not in the beginning. A passionate ecologist with an Ivy League education and a reputation for ethical fieldwork, Daniel once lectured on biodiversity conservation at global conferences. But behind his charming speeches was a gnawing ambition that led him into partnership with a pharmaceutical company promising miracles. If only he would cut a few corners in testing a plant-based cancer drug derived from an unclassified vine native to northern Peru. The initial studies were promising, even groundbreaking. But within a year, the trial was linked to several aggressive cases of organ failure, including one victim Daniel knew intimately, his own wife, Ellen. She had volunteered in the pilot study, trusting in his science, believing in his dream. Her death devastated him, but what truly fractured him was that he continued to accept the funding to expand the field testing. When journalists uncovered the truth, the scandal was explosive. His academic credentials were revoked. Institutions severed ties. His reputation was incinerated overnight. While the pharmaceutical executives vanished behind legal teams, Daniel was left alone to shoulder the guilt, the grief, and the worldwide condemnation. In the years that followed, he vanished from the public eye, choosing exile over explanations. Whispers claimed he was hiding in the Andes. Others said he was working for foreign governments under an alias. The truth was simpler and more haunting. Daniel had been preparing for one final journey, one he believed might cleanse his soul or bury it for good. The Amazon called to him not as a scientist, but as a supplicant. He liquidated his assets, sold his home, and gathered what little remained of his research gear. What he packed wasn't typical of a botanist. Along with notebooks and satellite GPS, he carried 2 wooden carvings of animals his wife once sketched in her journals, an old church bell from his childhood, and a single faded letter she wrote him during the height of the trial, sealed in wax and never opened. On the flight to Manaus, he barely spoke, choosing instead to stare out the window as the green expanse below thickened into an endless, living sea. Locals at the river port described him as polite but withdrawn, tipping generously but asking only for silence. He hired a small motorboat and a quiet guide named Marcos, requesting to be taken to the western stretches of the jungle, far beyond map trails, into regions the government had marked as culturally sensitive and largely off-limits. Marcos warned him repeatedly about the dangers, not just wildlife or terrain, but the whispers. Daniel didn't ask for clarification. He just nodded. They traveled upriver for 2 days. Daniel kept meticulous notes at first, sketching leaves, recording temperature fluctuations, even cataloguing the songs of birds at dawn. But by the 3rd morning, Marcos noticed something shift. Daniel had stopped writing. He no longer responded to questions. At one point, he stood at the river's edge for over 2 hours, eyes closed, whispering into the trees. Marcos grew uneasy and tried to convince him to return. Daniel refused. "There's something here," he said flatly. "It's not just plants." The next day, Marcos woke to find Daniel gone, his hammock empty, his pack missing. There were no footprints. Just an odd spiral drawn in mud near the fire pit. Marcos searched for hours, shouting into the thick jungle. Nothing. Eventually, he returned to the village and filed a report, assuming Daniel had been taken by a jaguar or fallen into a sinkhole. But then, 5 days later, Daniel came back. Not walking along the trail, not calling for help, but standing motionless in the middle of a clearing that hadn't been there before, his body covered in ash and clay, his pupils blown wide like he had seen something no man should. Locals said the forest doesn't kill everyone who enters. Some it keeps. Others, it sends back to deliver a message. 3 days before Daniel Holt vanished into the forest, the villagers of Alto Rio warned him, not with threats, but with silence. They watched from behind curtains as he loaded his supplies onto the small canoe he'd borrowed without asking. The edge of the river was calm, deceptive in its tranquility. His plan was simple on paper: travel southwest past the known medicinal zones and into what he marked as terra incognita, the uncharted region marked in red on every government map and whispered about by every elder who still remembered. Officially, it was labeled off-limits for preservation. Unofficially, it was a place avoided even by the illegal loggers and gold miners. There were stories of entire survey teams never returning, of military units withdrawing without explanation, of drones that entered and stopped transmitting within minutes. The forest there was different. It didn't just grow, it watched. Locals called it Terra do Sussurro, the land of whispers, because, even when the wind was still, voices seemed to echo between the trunks, especially at night. Daniel pushed off into the current without looking back. For the first day, he paddled alone in relative peace, surrounded by towering trees and thick, vibrant green that swallowed all sound except for the rhythmic dip of his oar. He camped near the bank that night and wrote about the bioluminescent fungus he found growing in geometric patterns, forming shapes like arrows and spirals. On the second day, he heard what he assumed was birdsong but realized after recording it that the notes repeated with unnatural precision, almost like a pattern being recited, not sung. He tried to follow the source but found nothing but a hollowed-out tree with dozens of claw marks along the inside bark, as though something had been trying to claw its way inward. That evening, as he sat by his fire, a figure appeared on the other side of the water. A child, naked, eyes black as coal, just staring. When Daniel blinked, it was gone. He dismissed it as fatigue, or a trick of the light. But deep down, he felt a tightening in his chest that hadn't been there before. A kind of recognition. By the third morning, he found the boundary. The forest floor abruptly changed. Moss gave way to blackened vines, the air grew thicker, and the sun struggled to reach through a tightly interwoven canopy. At the center of it all was a natural archway formed by two massive saber trees. Their trunks fused at the base, forming a perfect oval. Strange markings lined the bark, not cuts, but grown, like veins shaped into symbols. Daniel stepped through without hesitation, clutching the sealed letter from Ellen in one hand. The instant he crossed, every insect noise stopped. The air became heavy with the scent of earth and copper. The light shifted subtly, not to darkness but to a dull, golden hue, like he was underwater. His compass spun violently. His watch ticked backward. He should have turned around then. But he walked deeper. He radioed in that afternoon. Just once. A short, static-laced message caught by a nearby logging station. Found something, it's breathing, no roots, but it's alive. That was the last anyone heard from him. Search parties were launched within hours, but the GPS signal from his tracker was nonsensical, bouncing erratically before cutting out altogether. In the days that followed, villagers said the river level dropped overnight, exposing strange stone totems etched with faces that looked like they were screaming. Dogs refused to go near the river bank. Some villagers claimed to see smoke rising from the grove, not fire, but a silvery mist that curled toward the sky and then reversed direction, spiraling downward as if being inhaled. The rescue team found Daniel 5 days later, but no trace of his pack, his boat, or his camera. Only the sealed letter remained, clutched tightly in his right hand, unread and unburned, its wax seal now marked with a spiral that hadn't been there before. What he brought back wasn't just memory or madness, it was a fragment of a place not meant to be named. A grove that remembers. A grove that keeps what it takes. A grove that let Daniel walk away for a reason no one was ready to understand. Daniel Holt's return to the village of Alto Rio wasn't a reunion, it was an intrusion. No one greeted him. No one celebrated. The villagers watched from windows, fingers clutching crucifixes, as he was brought back by the rescue team like a relic retrieved from a burial ground. He didn't speak for the first 12 hours. He didn't eat, didn't blink often, didn't even react when a young boy accidentally dropped a pot near him. He only flinched at one thing, his own reflection. When he passed the clinic's mirror, he screamed and fell to the floor, scraping at his face as though trying to peel it off. The mirror was promptly removed. What few words he spoke were in broken syllables that didn't match any known language, but the rhythm of his speech caught the attention of Father João, the village priest, who claimed it bore resemblance to a funerary chant once documented in an obscure 19th-century explorer's journal. When this was shared with a visiting linguist, the expert confirmed something far more chilling. The phonetic structure Daniel spoke in was from multiple dead languages, some of which had never been heard together in recorded history. As the days passed, Daniel's behavior only grew more unnerving. At night, he would rise from his cot and trace spirals on the walls with charcoal and crushed leaves. Sometimes he would hum, not songs, but a single droning note that set off the dogs howling in unison. The villagers begged the local council to expel him, but Father João insisted he remain under supervision. To calm fears, the mayor called in a federal medical unit, equipped with psychologists, translators, and biometric sensors. When they arrived, Daniel was sedated for transport, but within an hour of arriving at the field lab, the sedation wore off prematurely. He stood up and calmly began carving symbols into the floor using a metal spoon. The guards attempted to stop him, but when they touched his skin, they recoiled. It wasn't heat or cold that startled them, it was vibration. His body was humming like a tuning fork, faint but undeniable. One officer fainted. Another claimed he could hear whispering, not from Daniel's mouth but from the walls themselves, repeating words in a child's voice. Recordings later confirmed that multiple background voices were present, all speaking ancient dialects layered under Daniel's faint breathing. Then came the carvings. Over the span of 2 days, Daniel filled 3 wooden panels with glyphs. When experts reviewed them, they were stunned. The symbols combined elements of ancient Marajora pottery patterns with Panoan script and unknowable sigils that didn't match any linguistic root. It wasn't just communication. It was ritual. A local shaman, Anai, was brought in to observe. She didn't need long. Upon entering the room, she went pale and refused to stay. Later, she told officials that Daniel's body was a drum for something else to speak through. That night, the power cut out in the lab. When it returned, Daniel was outside, kneeling in the garden, both hands buried in the soil, eyes rolled back, lips murmuring. The strange part. The door had remained locked from the inside, and no security footage showed him leaving. The government scientists were divided. Some believed he was experiencing an advanced form of fugue or jungle-induced psychosis. Others whispered that Daniel had crossed into something evolutionary, or spiritual. It was during the 4th night that things escalated. 3 men on the medical team were found sleepwalking in a spiral around Daniel's room, faces blank, muttering the same word, Irapuru. When questioned the next morning, none of them remembered anything. That same word was later discovered in a forgotten oral myth of a tribe eradicated over a century ago. A tale of a forest spirit that could borrow tongues to rewrite the memory of those who dared enter its sacred ground. The final straw came when Daniel, in a rare moment of lucidity, called out to Anai and whispered, "It sees through me." His voice wasn't his own, it was higher, younger, like a child echoing in a cave. After that, Anai declared that Daniel had no soul left, only a body with the forest inside it. The military shut the site down within 24 hours, citing biohazard concerns. Daniel was placed in an isolation facility far upriver. The last anyone in the village saw of him, he was being taken away in a helicopter, staring out the window with pupils the color of wet soil, unblinking and eerily calm. But even as he left, villagers swore they could still hear whispering from the trees. As if something hadn't gone with him, but stayed behind, listening. The facility where they took Daniel was meant for quarantining biological threats, experimental diseases, rare parasites, and unstable mental health cases too dangerous for regular clinics. But within a week of Daniel's arrival, the staff began requesting transfers. Not because he was violent. He wasn't. He barely moved. He would sit cross-legged on the padded floor of his sealed room for hours, sometimes days, staring at the corner wall where mold had begun to bloom in the shape of a spiral. His lips rarely moved, but the microphones embedded in the walls recorded audio 24 hours a day. What they picked up could not be explained. The recordings contained not just breathing or muttered words, but multi-layered whispering, voices overlapping in harmony and dissonance, speaking languages that included Tupi, Karu, and unclassified tonal patterns. One linguist, after analyzing the audio for 3 straight days, suffered a breakdown, claiming he had heard his deceased mother's voice within the patterns, warning him to stay out of the roots. The tapes were shelved. A new protocol was issued. No more live monitoring. Everything was now on delayed playback. Daniel, meanwhile, began moving in rhythms, not walking, but shifting his body in pulses that coincided with atmospheric pressure changes. Whenever there was a storm upriver, Daniel would go into a trance 12 minutes before the first drop of rain touched the roof. Every time. Like he was syncing with something deeper than weather, like he was receiving. Then came the drawings. Daniel began sketching on the walls using a mix of soil from his meals, strands of his own hair, and what little ink remained from a confiscated pen. The images were sprawling, spirals, vines, faces, eyes without lids. In one chilling mural, he drew a temple overgrown with flora, with tendrils creeping from its base and wrapping around human figures. One researcher from the National Anthropology Institute reviewed the sketches and grew pale. She pulled an old reference book from her bag and flipped to a 1907 photograph of a long-lost ceremonial site found deep in the Javari Valley. The similarities were uncanny, identical glyphs, layout, even the odd route formations. The issue? That site had been lost to a landslide in 1922 and was never mapped digitally. Daniel shouldn't have known it existed, let alone what it looked like. That night, Daniel stood up mid-meal, walked to the center of the room, and uttered a phrase in a dead tongue. Every camera inside his room short-circuited. The only surviving footage came from a hallway camera, showing shadows moving across the room's frosted window, not Daniel's shadow, but many. As if the room was filled. The next morning, he asked to speak to the soil. The guards thought it was a metaphor, but Daniel was insistent. They brought in a tray of untreated earth. He knelt before it and began whispering. Within minutes, seedlings began sprouting, not normal jungle growth, but translucent stalks that twisted as they grew, reacting to his breath. Botanists were called in. They'd never seen this genus. DNA testing returned inconclusive results. But one thing was certain, the forest was responding to him. Or through him. That afternoon, Daniel collapsed. He was unresponsive for nearly 10 hours. Medical teams assumed a seizure or internal hemorrhage. But when he awoke, he whispered coordinates. They didn't match any known grid reference in the facility's system. When cross-referenced with pre-GPS cartography, however, the coordinates pointed to a forgotten section of the Amazon basin, hundreds of miles from his original route, a place known in oral legend as Ikanamura, the breath between trees. No modern maps showed trails there. No drone had ever returned with footage. But Daniel had spoken it, clearly and calmly. The government launched a covert expedition within 72 hours, bringing in a small, armed scientific team. Daniel didn't go with them. But what he said before they left still echoes in transcripts. It wants to be remembered. The expedition reached the site after 9 days of difficult travel. What they found defied explanation. A massive root structure, shaped like an amphitheater, pulsing faintly beneath the soil, with stone carvings fused with wood and vines forming strange hybrid creatures. In the center stood an altar wrapped in bark, shaped like a human chest, with what looked like a fossilized heart beating just below its surface. One of the scientists, against protocol, touched the altar. He screamed and went still. His pulse stopped for 2 minutes. When revived, he looked around with wide eyes and whispered in Portuguese, "We are not alone in our memories." The team returned rattled. Footage was classified. The forest was declared off-limits by the government. And back in the facility, Daniel stood at his window, looked into the distance, and said one word, softly but clearly, "Home." 2 weeks after the covert expedition returned from Ikanamura, the facility housing Daniel Holt was evacuated. No official reason was given. A terse government statement cited structural concerns, but no one believed that. Not after what the team brought back, not just footage and samples, but behavior changes. Dr. Ruiz, one of the more skeptical scientists, resigned without warning and was later found living alone in a shack 50 miles upriver, claiming he could hear the trees breathe and refused to use electricity. Another team member, pale and trembling, reported dreams of roots growing through his skin and soil spilling from his mouth. Security footage showed him standing at his window at 3:17 a.m., repeating the same phrase over and over again in a childlike voice, "The ground remembers." Meanwhile, Daniel hadn't spoken in days. Not a word. Not a hum. He just stared out through the glass, sometimes for hours, his breath fogging the surface in a perfect spiral shape that never faded until wiped away. And then one morning, he was gone. There was no breach, no broken window, no unlocked door. He simply wasn't there. Cameras from the hallway showed nothing unusual. Guards claimed to have checked on him less than an hour earlier. The only clue was a trail of ash shaped like a vine leading from the center of the room to the wall. Not the door, the wall. And that wall was cold to the touch, yet steaming from within, as if the room had exhaled him. Panic surged through the chain of command. Helicopters were deployed. Villages were warned. But no trace of Daniel was ever found. Not a footprint, not a thread of clothing. Until 17 days later, when a lone member of the expedition team returned to Alto Rio. It was Dr. Aleixo, the cartographer. But the villagers didn't recognize him at first. His face was gaunt, his pupils unusually wide, and his voice was soft, distant. He spoke only in whispers. He refused to sleep indoors. He asked where the offering bowl had been placed, and when no one answered, he knelt beneath the saber tree in the village square and began humming, the same droning tone Daniel used weeks before. Children wept. Elders spat on the ground. Father João declared that the forest had not sent Daniel back to the world. It had spread through him, and now, through others. The village placed a perimeter of salt around the tree and left offerings of bark and soil. Not because of tradition, but because of fear. Strange symbols began appearing again, not drawn, but grown. Moss forming spirals. Tree bark peeling into eye-like shapes. Dogs refused to bark. At night, villagers claimed to hear laughter from the treetops, though no one dared investigate. Then, one morning, the spiral was gone from the village square, but a new one had been carved into the church doors. Not scratched in. Etched, clean and deep, as if done by a machine. The priest collapsed when he saw it. As for Dr. Aleixo, he vanished again the next night. In his place, someone found a map. Hand-drawn, incredibly detailed, showing a vast root system stretching beneath the forest. Not rivers or trails, but something older, living, sprawling beneath the earth. At its center was a symbol no one could decipher. Not quite a tree. Not quite a person. Something in between. The government quarantined the area within days. Alto Rio was marked as a restricted zone due to rare fungal outbreak, though the locals knew better. A wall was built around the outer grove, and armed men stood guard, but even they wouldn't patrol past sunset. Villagers say the forest isn't content with Daniel anymore. It wants memory, breath, voice, vessels to retell its story. And Daniel, whether chosen or cursed, was just the beginning. Weeks later, a missionary in Peru reported a young girl speaking in fluent Karu despite having no tribal ancestry. A fisherman in Colombia disappeared for 2 days and returned speaking only in symbols drawn on his skin. The forest, it seemed, had found its own form of language, and it was learning how to travel. Back in the capital, rumors persist of a room beneath a government facility that plays Daniel's last recorded message on loop, though no one knows who listens. Some claim Daniel became one with the forest, its voice, its messenger. Others believe he was hollowed out and used, like bark shaped into a flute. The question remains unanswered. Was Daniel possessed, or did he awaken something humanity had long buried? Something with roots older than civilization and a hunger that doesn't feed on flesh, but on remembrance. If you stand at the edge of the grove and hold your breath, some say the trees will whisper to you. And if you understand them, it's already too late.